We can now put the locomotive to one side and concentrate on the tender. The time you spend planning at this stage where everything will go will not be wasted. Remember, you have to fit the locomotive control unit, the plug charging unit, and most importantly the battery, which is likely to be the biggest component in the tender. Also, we need to plan where to locate the 9601 plug charging unit, the 9121 extension cable, and the loco switch for ease of access. Regarding the placement of the 9601 plug charging unit, which has to be both accessible and securely fixed, on a tender my first choice would usually be the tender filler at the back of the tender. Sometimes this is a detachable component on the tender, but this time we may not be so lucky. Firstly, separate the body from the chassis by removing the screws underneath the couplings at each end. One of the reasons I use kitchen roll is because I can write down which screw is which before securing them with a piece of sellotape. And here is a very good reason for choosing this model. There's plenty of room inside the tender. We're not quite so lucky with the tender filler though, because that's being used to secure the chassis. Position the largest component in the tender, in this case the battery, to see how it fits. At AXS we're aware that the 65-30-42 at 30 mm wide is slightly too wide for most 4 mm locos, and we will be trying to introduce a newer, less wide battery in due course. It doesn't matter if the battery is installed at an angle. Next, locate the loco control unit, paying attention to where the cable runs and the connectors are going to be most accessible. On the subject of accessibility, we then need to consider where to put the 9121 housing, and using the front draw hook securing screw would seem to be an opportunity. The concern then is how to take the cables of the 9121 through the floor to the body of the tender, and those metal plates may be a problem. Certainly the cable needs to avoid that leading axle. Next comes the all-important question of where to place the 9601. We need a secure fixing because of the force required to install and remove the cable, but also it needs to be unobtrusive so that we're not actually interfering too much with the bodywork of the tender. I'm afraid it looks like the tender filler is the only place, so it means that that long fixing spindle will have to go, and an alternative means of securing the rear of the tender will have to be found. The 9601 is slightly wider than the tender will permit, so we will need to remove part of the 9601 in order to fit it in the tender. Hold the 9601 in a vise well away from the electronics and other components in the center of the board so as not to damage them. Very gently cut away the unwanted parts of the board. In this case I'm using an abrasive disc in a high-speed drill. Smooth down any sharp edges with a needle file, paying particular attention if any of the holes have been opened up. Next, remove the retaining screw spigot, as this is where the 9601 will be located underneath the tank filler. Again, I find the easiest way is with an abrasive disc, but you have to be extremely careful not to damage the bodywork. Now is the time to open up the aperture where the charging plug will be inserted into the 9601, and for this we want to retain as much of the tank filler as we can. Start with a small drill as close to the center of the tank filler as you can judge, being extremely careful not to drill through the top plate. That's the lid of the tank filler, which we will want to keep to replace later on. Unfortunately, the tank filler is not a separate moulding, so again I'm using an abrasive disc and being extremely careful to avoid any mouldings we want to keep, especially on the body itself. We end up with the tube of the tank filler, which we open up with progressively larger drills until we have the aperture flush with the tender top. Again, a needle file will help to clean the edges of the aperture. A test fit of the 9601 shows that it actually appears through the aperture, and in this case it doesn't actually matter that it's not dead in the center. What does matter though is that there is sufficient clearance for the shroud of the plug charging cable. Now to arrange supports for the 9601 itself. It's essential that the 9601 is securely fixed in place and that it can be removed easily. The most essential feature is that the tender must offer resistance both when inserting and removing the plug charging cable to prevent damage to the tender itself. It's very convenient that the 9601 fits vertically inside the tender housing with no need for any additional spacers to take up any slack space. We want to end up with two plastic channels into which the 9601 can be slid and removed when required. I have raided my scrap box, which most modelers have, and I found some old sprues from some track chairs that I've used on the Brighton layout. I'm going to cut these down to act as the channels for our 9601. Cement the first pair in place before putting the second pair in to ensure a snug fit, but not a too tight fit for the 9601. Lastly, we need to remove the spigot on the chassis which was used to secure the body, as it will interfere with the 9601. Test fit the chassis to make sure that the 9601 is secure by inserting and removing gently the plug charging cable. While inspecting the inside of the tender body, I notice that the coal load is some distance away from the tender top moulding, and this will be too great a distance to operate the loco switch. As it happens, there is an aperture through the tender top, and I tried to see if I could prise apart the coal load from the tender. As it happens, I could, but in so doing I wish I'd done it earlier, because it revealed an alternative for the position of the 9601. In the event, though, it would have been too far forward for any use, so maybe it was a good thing that we didn't have that option earlier. Fold up the copper pad of the loco switch to be able to insert it through the aperture, and then gently pull the cable through, taking care not to break it from the 0502 loco control unit. Unwrap the copper pad, remove the backing paper, and firmly secure the adhesive side of the copper pad to the underside of the coal load. Test fit the battery and the loco control unit again to make sure that the cable runs are sufficient without being strained by being too tight. You need to make sure that the cables from the 9601 to the LCU do not become trapped when the chassis is replaced, and therefore, with a needle file, cut a small groove into the top of the 9601 to accommodate the cables. Test fit everything in place in the tender, although the 9121 will have to be loose for the time being as it's not been fixed in place. The metal weights used to prevent derailments of the tender will get in the way when the tender is assembled, and may have an effect on the radio transmission and the potential to cause a short circuit, so we should consider removing them. The plates weigh 32 grams and the Protocab components in the tender weigh 28 grams, so there's not a great loss. Now to the fixing of the 9121 extension cable. The screw that's used to hold the front drawbar coupling will be too short for our purposes, so I'll be replacing it with a longer 12BA bolt. Tap the existing hole for 12BA. I tap right the way through the hole, and I managed to find a 12BA slotted screw, which is much more convenient than the bolt would be. Assemble the 9121 above the draw hook coupling and secure with the screw, trimming the screw to length above the footplate. The cable of the 9121 now needs to be fed through the chassis, so cut a slot using 2 drills and a needle file. It's very important that the cable is not too tight and it avoids any moving parts such as that leading axle. Now is the time to come to the final assembly. The LCU will be separated from the battery by means of the 9959 heat absorbing pad that is included with the LCU. Peel back the backing tape on the 9950 heat absorbing pad and press the pad into the LCU, taking care to avoid the antenna and the motor connection cable socket. Connect the cable from the 9121 into the appropriate socket on the LCU and press the heat absorbing pad and LCU onto the battery, noting that it would be very desirable to be able to see the blitz light that's alongside the antenna. In the case of this tender, there is a very convenient fire iron tunnel aperture at the front of the tender. And don't worry, the blitz light does not stay on all the time, it's only there momentarily when you first switch on the LCU, and other times such as when you remove the plug charging cable. Finally, secure the LCU and the battery in place. For this I use a spare piece of track underlay 3mm foam, although you could, if you wish, use the conducting foam inside the box in which your 0502 was delivered. So that's it. Just connect the locomotive to the tender, charge up the battery and enjoy many happy hours of running through your Protocab system. Thank you for watching this AXS Protocab customer support video, and if you have any questions or comments, do please write to us at support@protocab.com.